Franklin Roosevelt was elected president in 1932. He had been governor of New York, and he brought many of his New York buddies with him to Washington. He was inaugurated on March 4th, 1933, and he had been elected on a platform that was called the New Deal. Now, if the New Deal had any kind of motto throughout the 1930s, I guess you could say it was relief, recovery, and reform. We historians have in the past divided the New Deal into two distinct parts, calling the first one conveniently the first New Deal, and the second part the second New Deal. More recent historians of the New Deal have argued against this periodization, and I see their point, but I think in order to analyze the New Deal at least to repeat the New Deal at the level of History 1112, we probably should simply leave that slightly older periodization in place. This will give you a better mechanism by which to wrap your minds around what happened in the New Deal and at least the components of the New Deal. And later, when you become a graduate student in history, and because I know all of you will, then you can argue the merits of whether or not to call it the first and second New Deal. Okay. When FDR, who you see pictured here at his first fireside chat, came to the presidency, he had no concrete ideas about the shape of what he had called on the campaign trail the New Deal for the Forgotten Man. His first New Deal was marked by an overreaching concern for relief and recovery. The second New Deal would be more about relief and reform. He and his advisors, called the Brains Trust, using that economic word for major conglomeration, the word trust to mean a major conglomeration of intellectuals. They called them the Brains Trust. Anyway, these guys, for the most part, particularly FDR, who was by no means particularly liberal, considered that there were two major problems that stood in the way of economic recovery. One of these major problems was what Hoover thought an unbalanced federal budget. The other was cutthroat competition, by which businesses undercut each other so much that they were actually selling at a loss. Well, to stimulate recovery primarily and relief secondarily, FDR and his Brain Trust came up with 15 major pieces of legislation passed during the first 100 days of his administration. Ever since then, the press has always looked at the first 100 days of an administration, of a new presidential administration, to give it a report card. Now, that didn't occur prior to the FDR's 100 days. He didn't sit down and say, in the next 100 days, we will pass 15 pieces of legislation. It just so happened that it took 100 days from his inaugural date to pass this legislation. He was inaugurated on March 4th. This period, known as the 100 days, lasted until June 16th, 1933. And again, they passed 15 pieces of major legislation, all distilled out of the thinking of this Brains Trust. Now, FDR, called by at least one individual a first-rate personality but a second-rate mind, was used his personality and the radio to promote his vision and his administration's vision of what they were trying to accomplish. And people took this to heart. FDR was great at this new medium of the radio. He really understood how to invite himself into a frightened people's living room via the radio and speak both to them and with them. And people responded. They liked FDR. Even people who hated his policies tended to like him personally. Well, the New Deal, if we want to analyze the New Deal, let's look at some of its components and break these 15 pieces of legislation down into both their individual parts and bring them back together into topical clusters. There are 3 of these topical clusters. The first one is banking and monetary reform. The second topical cluster is direct and indirect relief. And the third cluster is adjustment and recovery legislation. So now I want to talk about the individual pieces of legislation. The first, again, is monetary and banking legislation. When FDR took office on March 4th, there had been major runs on banks. This is a situation in which people would just simply go into a bank and all of them demand every penny that they'd ever put into that bank. Banks did not hold that money in reserve, and when they gave out all of the money that they had on hand and could not call in their loans fast enough, then they were bankrupt. They couldn't pay their obligations, and so they had to close their doors. Thousands of banks across the U.S. had closed their doors in the 2 weeks that preceded the inauguration. The very first thing that FDR did was to declare a bank holiday. This was probably outside of the Constitution. He didn't really have the power, but nobody was going to challenge him for a little while. And it would take a while for any lawsuit to get through the court system. He declared a bank holiday, and Congress passed a law on March 9th called the Emergency Banking Relief Act that not only made the bank holiday legal, but but provided a mechanism by which banks could be declared whole. That is, the Treasury was empowered by this legislation to test banks, to go out and look at their books, and to see which ones were actually healthy and which ones didn't have bad loans outstanding, and there are other monetary problems in banks. Anyway, within the first few weeks, they declared 5,000 banks healthy enough to reopen. And the Treasury was given the ability to manage failing banks until they either had to be closed or they became healthy enough to be reopened. By late June, well over 90% of banks in the U.S. had reopened. Less than 10% had had to shut down permanently because of the Emergency Banking Relief Act. Another banking act is the Glass-Steagall Banking Act that was just overturned in the 1990s. And what that did, it was passed on June 16th, the last day of this 100 days. What Glass-Steagall did was to regulate banks, separate commercial banking, like where you have your checking account, from investment banking, like some of the big banking houses that invest money in ventures, which had been a problem during the late 1920s. It also created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, that guaranteed bank deposits. This gave Americans more confidence that if they quit hiding their money in their mattress and put it into a bank, that even if the bank fell apart, the government would give them their money back. That's the FDIC. On April 19th, then another of this monetary legislation was that the U.S. abandoned the gold standard, thereby devaluing the currency, and which had the net effect of inflating the currency, putting more money into circulation. On May 27th, the Congress passed the Federal Securities Act, which established the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, not the Southeastern Conference, and regulated the stock market to provide another source of funding for homes and to relieve the mortgage crisis that was developing because banks would not lend money and were demanding payment in full on mortgages. The feds created the Homeowners Loan Act on June 13th. This provided loans to homeowners so they could either buy houses or they could pay off, they could refi their mortgages, and they could pay off their banks with federal money. To do the same for farms, because there was a real crisis in the farming sector with mortgage problems and foreclosures. Then the federal government on June 16th passed the Farm Credit Act. This provided a source of credit, not from banks, but from the federal government, in order to relieve the foreclosure crisis in the farming sector. Okay, people still needed relief. They needed to have employment and they needed to have money coming in. And so another batch, another cluster of legislation we can bring together as and call it direct and indirect relief legislation. We can cluster these pieces of legislation together. One of them is the Civilian Conservation Corps. This was direct relief, created on March 31st, 1933, which was a large public works program that took young men out of the city and out of the countryside if they were unemployed and put them to work building parks, building public facilities. This wasn't so much make work as it was the building of infrastructure in public areas. It did a number of things. One was it provided jobs and income, not only for these men, these young men, but also for their families, because the way they set up the pay in the CCC was the men would get a little bit of their pay. Some of their pay would be held back so that when they left the CCC, which was always a temporary gig anyway, then they would get a lump sum payment, and some of their money was sent back to their families. So it helped them help support their family and removed temptation. Another thing that by having too much money, another thing that the CCC did was, again, to pull these potentially volatile young men out of some pretty dire circumstances so they would not necessarily be tempted into political radicalism. The Federal Emergency Relief Act, FERA, passed on May 12th, gave money to governments to pay salaries rather than loaning money to governments like the Reconstruction Finance Corporation had done under Hoover, and the Reconstruction Finance Corporation continued to do that under FDR. The New Dealers created this government agency that gave grants of money to governmental bodies. Well, let me tell you an example of how this might have been used. During 1932, Auburn University did not pay its employees. Faculty didn't get paid, staff didn't get paid, the president didn't get paid, nobody at Auburn got paid, for example. This happened all over the place. When FERA money finally came through, there was some for back wages. Now, that was 1932. FERA, May 12, 1933, provided some money for current wages and some money for back wages for governmental bodies, and some people were able to claim some of their back wages, but they were paid in scrip. And if a business would take the scrip that's good. If it didn't take the script, well, you just had to figure out how to make do. And many people left government employment at that point. And another indirect relief. FERA was indirect relief. CCC was direct relief. Another indirect relief was the Tennessee Valley Authority. What George Norris had proposed in the 1920s and was shot down by Calvin Coolidge was brought back up and passed on May 18th. Now, this was a giant public works program and it was there to assist in land reclamation and flood control and hydroelectric generation, but mainly to put money into the hands of people who lived in lower Appalachia, that is, through the mountains of Tennessee into the mountains of North Alabama. What George Norris wanted was for this to be a model for massive rehab projects in the far west, massive dam projects in the far west. Norris was from Nebraska. So these were the indirect and direct relief components of the New Deal. Finally, we get to the last of these three major clusters, adjustment and recovery. The first adjustment and recovery acts that we want to talk about are is the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, passed on May 12th. This wanted to raise crop prices by paying landowners to take their land out of production and to take animals out of production. Now, this seems perverse and counterintuitive, but one of the things that the New Dealers thought was going on was that there was a glut of all kinds of product on the market. And so the way to increase the take-home pay, you might say, of farmers was to reduce the amount of product that they were putting out on the market. Well, the only way to do that was to either plow up currently growing crops. I mean, look at this, May 12th. That's well into the growing season, was to plow up crops. But then how are farmers going to make it? So the AAA made payments to landowners to take their land out of production. Another perversity here was the perception, and probably quite true, that that foodstuffs were being thrown away rather than given away to people who were starving. Millions of gallons of milk were poured out, sometimes just in protest, and millions of piglets were slaughtered as well because of the AAA. Unfortunately, the payment mechanism in the AAA was first subject to legal challenge, and ultimately the AAA was declared unconstitutional and had to be revamped. But in the South in particular, because payments were made to landowners, then landowners taking their land out of production threw sharecroppers off the land. And so another perverse outcome of the AAA was to increase unemployment in rural areas of the South. Well, the National Industrial Recovery Act is the last of these acts that we want to talk about. It was passed on June 16th and is probably the premier and central act of the first New Deal. It's called by Ellis Hawley, a historian of the era, Hooverism in high gear, because it relied, like Hoover did, on trade associations. Trade associations, groups of businesses would, of a particular industry, would form themselves up, and they would write codes of fair competition that then would have, you might say, the force of law. They were there to reduce cutthroat competition, and ultimately over 900 industries either wrote codes of fair competition or adopted the so-called Presidential Code of Fair Competition. Now, every code of fair competition was required by Section 7A of the NIRA to have in it a clause that recognized the right of labor to organize and bargain collectively. This is, Section 7A. It said, if you agree to the Code of Fair Competition and agree to live by it, you have to agree that labor has a right to organize and bargain collectively. And so labor took this as the federal government, particularly President Roosevelt, wanting them to organize. And it led to a massive organization drive in 1934 that led to a lot of industrial turmoil, but that's for a little bit later. Anyway, the National Industrial Recovery Act was administered by the National Recovery Administration, the NRA, and you can see its emblem here, one of its many emblems here. The NRA was under the control of General Hugh Johnson, who was pretty volatile and had a pretty serious drinking problem that ultimately led to his having to leave the NRA. But what he was really good at was the thing that the NRA could do, which was to cajole businesses to adopt the Code of Fair Competition. And he did this through the Blue Eagle campaign of 1933-34. That is, he did a big advertising campaign to use moral suasion and popular pressure to get businesses to agree to their industry's Code of Fair Competition. And he did that by saying, or by convincing people to patronize only those businesses that were awarded and showed publicly their NRA emblem, which one of which you can see in this. Now, eventually, are also, in addition to creating codes of fair competition and a couple of other things, the National Industrial Recovery Act of June 16th also created a direct relief organization called the Public Works Administration, the PWA. P is in public, W is in works, A is in administration. And this administration was charged with creating for urban workers, or at least in urban and city areas, what the CCC was doing out in the national parks and in state parks, which was creating work projects that would improve the infrastructure, but also employ a lot of people. Well, the administrator for the PWA doled out the money so carefully that it really didn't help the economy. But nevertheless, it became a model for one of the most significant of the second New Deal programs with slightly different arrangement of initials, the WPA. We'll talk about that when we get to it. Now, of course, the New Deal, particularly the NIRA, had many enemies and opponents. Businesses and the wealthy eventually considered FDR to be a class traitor. Because they didn't like the codes of fair competition, or didn't think that unions had a right to organize, or did not think that the federal government ought to be doing this kind of thing. In fact, as you can see from the slide, FDR's next door neighbor from Hyde Park, New York, exiled himself to the Bahamas until 1946 because he was so angry at the New Deal. Conservative Democrats were also, mostly from the South, were also enemies of the New Deal, in some part because they didn't like the federal government to take such a large hand in the economy and in society, and in other part because the New Deal wrecked many of the um, financial arrangements and streams of financing um, of the local economies. It gave the poor other ways of getting money than being beholden to local landowners and local merchants. And so many, this hit people in the pocketbook. And so many conservative Democrats, particularly from the South, did not like it. There's another major group of opponents of the New Deal who we might call populists, from right-wing populists to who knows if he's right-wing or left-wing populist Huey Long, to Francis Townsend. Well, the first of these was the radio priest, Father Coughlin, Father Charles Coughlin. He had vague political demands. At first, he loved FDR, and then after getting hooked up with Gerald C.K. Smith, he began sounding more and more authoritarian and more right-wing populist, even kind of fascist. And he spent a lot of time on the radio doing the opposite of FDR, but using the radio just as effectively. He had millions of followers across the U.S. Another populist opponent was Dr. Francis Townsend, who in a letter to the editor of a California newspaper promoted a scheme by which the federal government would guarantee incomes for people over the age of 60 if those people spent every penny of the money that they got per month and didn't save any of it. Now you may say, oh, that's crazy, they should save some. But the point was to pour money into the economy through older hands. That would help older people who did not have the ability to work necessarily anymore, and were also having trouble finding jobs, and it would put money into the economy. Ultimately, to suck the wind out of the sails of the Townsend clubs, which had developed, we ended up with Social Security. And finally, and the most dangerous of these opponents to the New Deal was former governor and current senator from Louisiana, Huey Kingfish Long, whose share the wealth plan and motto of every man a king led him to be the point of the spear of populist, I guess, attacks from the left wing, though Huey Long himself was something of a dictator in Louisiana. Huey Long probably would have run for president and may have done pretty well, but in 1935, a local political opponent in Baton Rouge, a judge whose career had been ruined by Long's henchmen, then his son, Dr. Carl Weiss, assassinated Huey Long on the steps of the Capitol in Baton Rouge in 1935. Here's an image of some of the enemies of the New Deal. I'm sorry, there's a problem with the first part of this. The first picture off on the left, that's Huey Long with his fist raised in the air. You can see Dr. Townsend below him. And I guess Charles Coughlin has his fist raised in the air too. There's a lot of fist raising and pounding on desks in this era. It was one of those gestures that had great currency. Now, in the middle is one of my favorite cartoons of the era, and it's from the New Yorker, in which the young girl, it's a little hard to see it here, I apologize, the young girl is tattling to their mother on her brother, saying, "Mother, Wilfred has written a dirty word," and that dirty word, of course, is Roosevelt. So this played out quite a bit. The New Yorker has hundreds of these cartoons, kind of teasing in this tongue-in-cheek way the anti-Roosevelt type. Well, the first New Deal ended in 1935 and 36 when the Supreme Court, finally getting a case,
through the court system, declared the National Industrial Recovery Act unconstitutional. This is the Schechter Poultry versus U.S. Case, pardon me, also known as the sick chicken case. And I won't go into it, but it led the Supreme Court to declare the National Industrial Recovery Act unconstitutional. Well, to no one's great consternation, even the New Dealers, by 1935, the NIRA, that signature act, was dead in the water. The times had passed it by. Politically, times had passed it by. The NIRA didn't work real well. The codes of fair competition were a thorn in the side. The only real benefit was that unions decided to go on an all-out organizing kick. And there's some other reasons they could organize also, including the 1930 Norris LaGuardia Act and the 1935 Wagner Act. In 1936, U.S. v. Butler declared the AAA unconstitutional, but that was because of a technicality, and so it became it was revised and rewritten by 1938. It was obvious, however, that the Supreme Court was going out of its way to try to kill the New Deal, and that leads us to the second New Deal, which we will take up in the next lecture. The New Deal came about in the first 100 days as 15 major pieces of legislation passed by Congress to thwart this emergency known as the Great Depression. You can divide these, as we have, into three clusters. The first cluster is banking and monetary reform. The second is direct and indirect relief. The third is adjustment and recovery. There were opponents and enemies of the first New Deal, and the New Deal was killed by being worn out and by the Supreme Court in 1935. Thank you very much.